In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a storm was brewing. 6 months had passed since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, where Japan's sudden strike had crippled the United States Pacific Fleet and dragged America into the Second World War. The Imperial Japanese Navy stood undefeated, stretching its power from the shores of Southeast Asia to the farthest islands of the Pacific. It was the age of Japan's dominance, an empire rising on the ashes of its enemies. But deep beneath the confidence of the Japanese High Command, something dangerous was growing: overconfidence. The victories at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies had convinced them that the United States was weak, unprepared, and incapable of resistance. To Japan's leaders, the Pacific had become their empire's playground, and they believed the Americans could never recover fast enough to pose a serious threat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, saw things differently. He understood that the United States, with its vast industrial capacity, was not a sleeping enemy to be taken lightly. He knew America would rise again, stronger, angrier, and more determined. To prevent that, Yamamoto planned to crush the US Navy once and for all in a decisive battle that would destroy their remaining aircraft carriers and force America to negotiate for peace. The location chosen for this confrontation was a small, isolated atoll in the Central Pacific, Midway Island. Barely visible on a map, Midway held strategic importance far greater than its size. It was the final barrier between Japan and the Hawaiian Islands, and if captured, it would expose Pearl Harbor to direct attack once again. In early 1942, Japanese intelligence began to prepare the operation. They named it Operation Me. The plan was simple, yet elegant. Lure what remained of the US Pacific Fleet into a trap near Midway, destroy their carriers, and claim total control of the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese would send a diversionary force toward the Aleutian Islands in Alaska to distract the Americans, while their main fleet struck at Midway itself. But what the Japanese didn't know was that the Americans had cracked their naval codes. In a secret operation led by US Navy intelligence officers in Hawaii, Japanese communications were being intercepted and decoded. By late May 1942, American Krypton lists had confirmed that after a mysterious location the Japanese planned to attack was indeed Midway. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the US Pacific Fleet, now held the most valuable weapon in warfare, information. Armed with knowledge of Yamamoto's plan, Nimitz began preparing his own ambush. He gathered every available carrier, aircraft, and pilot, even those still under repair from the earlier battles. 3 American carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown, were ordered to Midway to lie in wait. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, confidence soared. Their fleet was vast. 4 of their best carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. They were led by Admiral Keiichi Nagumo, the same man who had commanded the carriers during Pearl Harbor. Every sailor, every pilot, believed victory was assured. In the weeks before the battle, both sides unknowingly prepared for one of the most important naval engagements in history. For the Americans, it was a desperate stand, a chance to stop Japan's advance before it reached Hawaii or even the US mainland. For Japan, it was an opportunity to eliminate the last American carriers and secure dominance over the Pacific once and for all. As the days counted down to June 4, 1942, tension hung thick across the Pacific. On Midway Atoll itself, a small US garrison of Marines and airmen reinforced their defenses, building sandbag walls, digging trenches, and readying anti-aircraft guns. They knew an attack was coming, though not the scale of it. The American carriers sailed quietly under radio silence, their crews aware they were heading into a storm. On the flight decks, pilots of the US Navy and Marine Corps prepared for what might be their final mission. Some were veterans from the early Pacific skirmishes, but many were young, barely trained, and facing their first combat. Thousands of miles away, the Japanese fleet steamed toward Midway in perfect formation. The waters ahead seemed calm, the sky clear, a false peace before the chaos of battle. Below deck, mechanics worked tirelessly, checking torpedoes and aircraft engines. Pilots studied maps, confident that their surprise attack would once again crush the Americans. In Tokyo, military leaders prepared to announce another glorious victory to the people of Japan. They had no idea that their secret plan was already known to the enemy. Back in Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz stood over a large map of the Pacific, silent but resolute. He knew the coming battle would determine the fate of the war in the Pacific. If the Americans lost, Hawaii, and possibly the entire Pacific coast, could fall into Japanese hands. But if they won, it could mark the beginning of Japan's downfall. The stage was set. Two powerful fleets were moving toward each other across thousands of miles of ocean, unaware that destiny was already in motion. In a matter of days, the calm blue waters of the Pacific would erupt into fire, smoke, and chaos. The world would soon witness the first major defeat of Imperial Japan at a place called Midway. As dawn broke on June 4, 1942, the stillness of the Pacific was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines. The Japanese strike force had arrived over Midway. More than 100 planes filled the morning sky, descending like a swarm of steel wasps. Below, the American defenders scrambled into action. Sirens wailed across the atoll as anti-aircraft gunners manned their positions and pilots rushed to their planes. The first Japanese bombs fell on Midway's airfields, tearing through runways and fuel tanks, sending black smoke billowing into the sky. The island shook under the bombardment, but the defenders refused to yield. American Marine pilots took off under fire, their outdated aircraft no match for the agile Japanese Zeros, yet they fought bravely. Many never returned. From the skies above Midway, the Japanese commander radioed back to Admiral Nagumo. Midway's defenses were damaged, but not destroyed. A second strike was needed to finish the job. On the decks of Nagumo's four carriers Akagi, Kogos Oyu, and Herihu's crews began rearming their planes for another attack on Midway. Bombs were being swapped for torpedoes, as the admiral had to be ready in case American ships appeared. Then, a message came through that changed everything. A Japanese scout plane reported sighting enemy ships to the northeast. The Americans were closer than expected. For Nagumo, it was a moment of chaos and decision. His planes were half-armed, his decks cluttered with bombs and fuel hoses. Should he strike Midway again, or rearm to face the approaching US fleet? Minutes turned into confusion, and in those critical minutes, fate turned against Japan, because while the Japanese were still rearming, American planes were already in the air, searching for them. The first waves of US torpedo bombers came in low and slow, flying straight into a wall of anti-aircraft fire. They were massacred. Squadron after squadron was wiped out. Torpedo 8, Torpedo 6, Torpedo 3 each, suffering near total loss. But their sacrifice was not in vain. As the Japanese fighters dove low to destroy the torpedo planes, they left the skies above unguarded, and that's when the American dive bombers arrived. From high above the clouds, pilots from the USS Enterprise and Yorktown spotted the Japanese fleet below, their carriers fully exposed. In a matter of seconds, they dived. Bombs screamed through the air and struck with deadly precision. In less than 5 minutes, the tide of the entire war changed. The carrier Kaga was hit first, then Akabagi and Soryu. Massive explosions ripped through the decks, igniting fuel and ammunition. Flames engulfed the ships as sailors desperately tried to fight the fires. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy was burning before their eyes. Only the carrier Hiryu remained. Furious and desperate for revenge, Hiryu launched her planes found and hit the USS Yorktown with deadly accuracy, crippling the ship. For a brief moment, it seemed Japan might still turn the battle around, but later that same afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu. They struck her with 4 direct hits. The explosions sealed her fate. By sunset, all 4 Japanese carriers were ablaze, their crews abandoning ship into the dark waters. The once invincible fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor was gone. The Pacific was silent again, except for the crackling flames and the cries of men clinging to the wreckage. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were lost. For the United States, the victory came at a heavy cost, but it was a turning point. The Battle of Midway had ended, and for the first time in the war, Japan had been decisively defeated. In the days that followed the Battle of Midway, the Pacific Ocean was littered with the wreckage of burning ships and floating debris. Smoke still rose from the horizon where the proud Japanese carriers had once ruled. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a blow from which it would never truly recover. 4 carriers, over 300 planes, and thousands of experienced sailors and pilots were gone. It was more than just a loss of ships. It was the destruction of Japan's naval air power, the very core of its offensive strength. For months, the Japanese had seemed unstoppable. They had conquered vast territories across Asia and the Pacific, But at Midway, the illusion of invincibility was shattered. The balance of power had shifted. On the American side, news of the victory spread like wildfire. In the United States, it was celebrated as a miracle. After months of grim defeats, from Pearl Harbor to the fall of the Philippines, Midway restored hope. It showed that Japan could be beaten and that the tide of war could turn. But the victory did not come easily. Many American pilots and sailors had given their lives in the battle. The USS Yorktown, one of the 3 U.S. carriers that fought at Midway, sank after being torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. The price of victory was steep, but it had been worth it. For Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Midway was proof that careful planning, intelligence, and courage could triumph over sheer power. He knew the battle had been won not just on the sea, but in the minds of men through strategy, patience, and a little bit of luck. The American codebreakers who had cracked Japan's secret communications played a crucial role. Without them, the US would never have known where or when Japan planned to strike. Their quiet work behind closed doors had helped shape one of the most decisive victories in modern warfare. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the news was devastating. Emperor Hirohito and his generals could hardly believe what had happened. The Japanese High Command tried to conceal the full extent of the loss from the public. Reporting, only that a fierce battle had taken place near Midway. But among those who knew the truth, the realization was grim. Japan's dream of dominating the Pacific had died in those waters. For the first time, Japan was on the defensive. Its once mighty navy could no longer replace the ships or pilots it had lost. The US, on the other hand, had the industrial might to rebuild and grow stronger with every passing month. From this point forward, the momentum of the war began to change. American forces started planning counterattacks Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, the Philippines. The road to victory was still long, but Midway marked the moment when the Allies stopped retreating and began to advance. The Pacific, once ruled by Japan, would soon become a battlefield of retribution. The Battle of Midway did more than sink ships and planes. It changed the psychology of the entire war. Before Midway, Japan had been the hunter, striking with speed and precision, seizing island after island. After Midway, Japan became the hunted. Its aura of invincibility vanished, replaced by fear and caution. Every commander in the Imperial Navy knew that one mistake could mean disaster. The defeat also exposed the limits of Japan's military strategy. For months, they had believed that superior training and spirit could overcome any enemy. But Midway proved that technology, intelligence, and logistics were just as important as bravery. Japan had stretched its resources too far, while the United States had only begun to mobilize its vast industrial and manpower potential. American factories were building ships, planes, and weapons at a speed Japan could never match. For every carrier Japan lost, the US built several more. In a few short months, the balance of naval power would shift decisively. The Japanese pilots lost at Midway were some of their most skilled veterans, irreplaceable men trained before the war. Their loss crippled Japan's ability to wage prolonged air battles. New recruits were rushed into combat with little experience, while American pilots were getting better with every engagement. On the home front, the psychological impact was enormous. In Japan, government propaganda tried to maintain morale, but whispers of defeat spread among the military and the public. The once proud fleet that had humiliated the West at Pearl Harbor was now silent. In contrast, the United States saw a surge of confidence. Midway became a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. Newspapers called it a miracle victory. The American people, still grieving from Pearl Harbor, felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was proof that courage, intelligence, and sacrifice could turn despair into triumph. Admiral Nimitz, reflecting on the victory, said it was achieved by divine guidance and the bravery of ordinary men. The battle also transformed naval warfare itself. It was the first major battle in history fought entirely by aircraft carriers. The ships never saw each other directly. Instead, planes carried out the destruction miles away from their bases. Midway demonstrated the future of war at Sea 1, where air power, not battleships, would decide the outcome. Every navy in the world took note. The lessons learned at Midway would shape strategy for decades to come. But for the men who fought there, it was not about grand strategy or politics. It was about survival, brotherhood, and courage in the face of impossible odds. Many of them never returned home. Their stories, buried beneath the waves of the Pacific, became legends of valor and sacrifice. Behind the grand strategies and naval maneuvers of the Battle of Midway were thousands of men who faced fear, exhaustion, and death in the middle of the Pacific. For the pilots, every takeoff could have been their last. They flew into clouds of anti-aircraft fire, knowing that many would never return. The ocean below offered no mercy. If their planes were hit, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Some drifted for days on the open sea, clinging to wreckage, praying for rescue. Others simply vanished beneath the waves. On both sides, the battle tested the limits of human endurance. Japanese pilots and sailors fought with unwavering loyalty to their emperor and nation, believing that dying in battle was the greatest honor. American crews fought for survival, for duty, and for the hope of returning home. Despite the hatred that war breeds, there were moments of shared humanity. Survivors rescued from the sea sometimes spoke of the haunting silence after the battle, the eerie calm, broken only by the cries of wounded men and the sound of burning ships. For many, the psychological scars lasted a lifetime. The pilots who survived carried memories they could never erase: the screams of their comrades, the sight of planes bursting into flames, the smell of oil and death in the air. Some never spoke of it again. Others told their stories decades later, their voices trembling as they recalled those moments over the endless blue of the Pacific. The Battle of Midway was not just a military victory, it was a human tragedy. Over 3,000 Japanese and more than 300 Americans died in those few days. Every number represented a life, a family, a story cut short. Yet in the midst of that loss, there was also heroism. Men who refused to give up, who flew into danger knowing they would not return. Their courage changed the course of history. On the decks of sinking carriers, Japanese sailors saluted as their ships went down. On American carriers, crews cheered their returning heroes, tears mixing with sweat and oil. It was a battle fought not just with weapons, but with spirit. The courage of those men on both sides became a testament to the resilience of the human soul, a reminder that even in the darkest hours of war, there can still be honor, sacrifice, and hope. The Battle of Midway marked a turning point, not only in World War II, but in the entire history of naval warfare. In just a few days, the course of the Pacific War was reversed. Japan's expansion was halted, and the United States seized the strategic initiative. From that moment on, the American Navy would push forward, island by island, until the rising sun of Japan began to fade over the Pacific horizon. For historians, Midway stands as one of the most decisive battles ever fought. It was a perfect storm of intelligence, bravery, and timing. Every decision, every moment of luck, every act of sacrifice combined to change the fate of nations. The lessons of Midway are still studied today in military academies around the world. It showed that information could be more powerful than numbers, that courage could overcome superior firepower, and that even in the face of overwhelming odds, human determination can alter the future. For the Japanese, the defeat forced a painful realization. Their empire had reached its limit. What had begun as a vision of domination turned into a desperate struggle for survival. For the Americans, Midway was proof that the tide had turned. The men who fought there became legends. Their victory inspired those who would later fight at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. It became the heartbeat of a new spirit in the Pacific, the belief that freedom could endure and triumph even against the darkest storms. Decades later, as survivors grew old and memories began to fade, the ocean remained silent over the graves of the fallen. Beneath those waves rest the wrecks of ships and the remains of men who changed history. The sea keeps their secrets, but their legacy lives on in every story told, in every lesson learned, in every moment of peace that followed. Midway was not just a battle of ships and planes. It was a battle of will and belief. It proved that even in war's chaos, there can be clarity. That courage, when guided by purpose, can change the destiny of nations. And as the sun sets over the endless Pacific, the memory of Midway reminds us that history is written not by power alone, but by those who dared to fight when all hope seemed lost.